exactly when did we start sending our senior civil servants and ministers to the Harvard Business School? This is what happened. Because this is what they came back with. That's the indoctrination center.
They came back with the Washington Consensus.
No, I think there are 2 points here. The point is that the social democratic ideals, which they started up with, MM had a knee-jerk reaction, and he reacted against the Bevanites. So in reacting against it, they jumped from the fire, from the pot into the fire with the adoption of that market-oriented economy.
Yeah, to be fair, I think it was a little more complex than that. It was not quite that way, at least for the first generation. For the first generation, people like Dr. Goh Keng Swee, who had heard Aneurin Bevan himself, and so that, and they were deeply skeptical of the NHS and welfare and all these things. So they had this Victorian idea that, welfare was bad. But hey, they had nothing against massive land reform. Something that Aneurin Bevan would never do. We would never think about it, right? Only the Communist Chinese Party did it. The scale that we did it, they were willing to do that. So in essence, yes, they were anti-welfare, but they were what you call pragmatic socialists. They only did what they thought would work, but they were not afraid of doing what they thought would work, even if it was land reform. Here we were, so this was the generation, this was Goh Keng Swee's generation. And he did remarkable institutional innovation. He created Keppel, Sembawang, there was SIA, there was DBS, there was JTC, there was EDB, there was GSE, there was MAS. Well, what do you want? Many of these were the leading light institutions of their time for developing countries. If you look at their social policy, what did you see? You saw socialist social policy. Essentially, what was there? There was universal healthcare. There was an education system that really was largely egalitarian. It brought a lot of people from the kampongs, from the one-room flats, into the professional classes, right? Because it was a more level playing field at that time in education. Under Goh Keng Swee, he expects you, when you come up with a policy, he says there are 3 things I want you to do. The first, I want you to read every goddamn thing you can about it. We had to discuss Keynes' general theory at MAS board meeting, at MAS market meetings. 2, he said, I want you to go down to the shop floor. I don't just want you to read, I want you to talk, not to the CIO, talk to the shop floor supervisor, engineer, who manages this operation that you're talking about, and interview him until you've got all his local knowledge, as much as you can. 3, I want you to come up with a solution that isn't already there, because there is still a problem. If you don't fulfill these 3 things, you've got no future under Goh Keng Swee. Under that regime, he was not afraid to continuously, intelligently intervene in the economy. Sometimes wrongly, quite often wrongly, but sometimes very intelligently. He was able to talk about those kinds of innovative policies. Under the new regime, we'll never get that. Not because they're anti-nostalgia, but because they have for 2 decades gone throughout the business school, embraced the fact that the market knows best. When shown by the market, unfortunately, since the great financial crisis, that the market didn't know best, it was leading us all off an abyss, which it did. We haven't yet recovered the sense of intelligent intervention in government. Now, why have we not recovered? It's more complex than just nostalgia, I grant you that. It's more complex because the reason we haven't, even though people are paid 10 times better and are probably 3 times smarter in terms of being educated, is because we've created a system that discourages change. The bureaucratic system paying civil servants wages 3 times what they can get, 2-3 times what they get outside, discourages change.
Actually, on this point, I just
we're subsidizing people
and
not to change.
Even that was the decision of Lee Kuan Yew's and not the second and third generation, by the way.
Yes, it was.
He made sure that happened before he stepped down from his prime ministership.
Yep.
Okay, because that happened exactly at the same time as his minister's salary went up. So I think we have to put responsibility where it lies. I don't think Lee Kuan Yew did all the right things.
No.
That's one of the things he did disastrously.
Yes.
20 years later, 2011 election is still a reflection of people's anger about salary.
But it's not just academic. I don't like this high pay. It is morally. There are real consequences in terms of innovative action and the lack thereof, all dried up.
And I think the political cost is clear. I think in 2011, that was part of the political cost.
Yes, and unfortunately, neoliberalism sits very easily with doing nothing.
Yeah.
Because doing nothing is to
Market.
leave it to the market.
Yeah.
This is what Mr. Lim Seong Wan refers to as lazy policy. He uses a new euphemism now. He calls it lazy policy.
May I use an analogy about nostalgia? My problem with this nostalgia is that it's actually created a cocoon, but we don't have a larvae within the cocoon to be able to break out of the chrysalis to come into a new form. So we are actually stymied by this nostalgia cocoon that is lacking the intelligence of the first generation that built the spaceship that gave rise to this cocoon.
Okay, let me describe the two spaceships.
Yeah.
The first generation under Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, you'll be surprised to hear that in cabinet, it was a rowdy, rambunctious, often disagreeing and shouting down the Prime Minister, doing things first and getting forgiveness. Goh Keng Swee's favorite maxim was easier to get forgiveness than to ask for approval. Do first, tell Harry later. Okay, it's literally. And the beauty of that system was that Harry encouraged it. Harry was a good
at that time.
At that time,
Yeah.
he was an excellent manager. He knew that to manage a group of innovative people, you have to give them free rein.
He was able to
Actually, I just want to elaborate on
He
this.
knew that Goh Keng Swee was a far better
Yeah.
economic architect than him. He knew that Lim Kim Sang was a far better builder than him. He knew that Rajaratnam was a far better policy diplomat than him, right? And he let their genius play, and that was what created the miracle.
Yesterday, I had an interesting discussion with a very senior bureaucrat who is retired, but from that generation. He said that in his day, whenever they did a policy paper, they always had a separate section on minority view,
dissenting view.
dissenting view. So they would express their dissenting view.
Compulsory.
This is what I say, this is what my department says, but this is what I say.
I see.
So they were systematic
And who, do
in
you,
the sense.
and who do you think put
Yeah.
that thing in is Goh Keng Swee? Because
That's
he
gone.
did not. He wanted to see
That's
the
gone.
dissenting
Gone,
view.
it's gone. Now just one paper.
Now is consensus.
Yeah.
You don't challenge me, I don't challenge you.
Correct. Yeah.
Nothing gets up.
Okay. Why did this Camelot, right, round table of equals, right, why did it break down? I think for two reasons. One is, I think Lee Kuan Yew had to ensure succession to Lee Hsien Loong in 10 years hence. So the intervening cabinet had to be yes man. First reason. The more important reason is Beng Huat's reason, which is because I'm paying these jokers 3 times more, everybody is like this. The market is more important, it is more effective. This is what you call market-based authoritarianism. The market is more important, it's more effective than any secret police. Okay, you pay people enough, they'll keep quiet. That's a law of microeconomics. Yeah, sorry.
Paying guys a lot. In fact, outside the industry, guys are paid a lot more sometimes even than some of our so-called senior civil servants. But the difference is this: outside, you don't perform. The first year you get a warning letter. The second year you get fired. Okay, and I can name a lot of CEOs who got fired. Guys in my industry. In Singapore, you screw things up, you get transferred. You mess up the Little India riots and you become head of the PUB.
You get promoted.
Yeah, you get promoted.
You get promoted.
Do
So
nothing, also get bonus.
yeah, so okay, so let's just leave off this for the time being because I want to get through the economics.
Yeah, okay.
I want to talk about this because this is important. There's an important demographic and economic dynamic that's going on here that all of us must understand. All right. Now, this chart is very, very important. It is as important in Singapore as the previous chart, which explains Donald Trump and Brexit, is externally. Both these forces are operating on our economy, so we understand both these forces. This force shows, and this is done by the Institute of Policy Studies, demographer department. It's a very simple calculation. It goes from 2010 to 2050. Singapore's future, all right? Future of our kids. And the different colored lines represent different rates of labor force growth. Now, I told you before, total growth is labor force growth plus productivity growth. If we had continued with the Go for Growth strategy to the end of 2050s,
that's the purple line, is it?
This is the purple line. Okay. This was the rate at which our labor force is growing for the last 20 years, since 1990. If we just project it out, this is the final population of Singapore in whatever date, earlier or later. We would have ended up in 2050 not with 6.9 million, but with 17.9 million people here. The white paper, I think, censored themselves and cut themselves off at 2030 because you don't see this, right? 2030 you don't see this. But if you were honestly projected, if the white paper really wanted to be honest, which is that we would have got to nearly 18 million on our fair island, okay? And not only that, but look at this. This is 1.7% labor force growth. It's at the higher end of the permissible rate of labor force growth under the 2010 Economic Strategies Committee. Tharman's recommendation was for 1 to 2. If you're at the higher end of that range, i.e. 1.7, you will get to 10 million by 2050, not 6.9, as enunciated by PMD at the last parliamentary discussion when it closed, right? He said, I certainly hope it will be below 6.9. He hasn't seen his chart. Imagine what life will be like from anything from 8 up to 10 to 11. Unless you have listened to Taking Sun and you engineered your living space accordingly, life would be miserable. Lee Kuan Yew himself didn't want a population bigger than 4.5 million. With our configuration now, what this means is if we don't tear down the new towns, is that most of the major new towns, Ang Mo Kio, Bishan, etc., will be like Mongkok. Will have the density of Mongkok, okay? It will be bloody difficult for everybody living there, for the majority of Singaporeans, for 80% of our population. What will not change is the Bukit Timas, the gazetted freehold lands, the bungalows, right? So imagine what that does to the disparity of wealth. And you have a lot more foreigners. You have 60% new foreigners. Imagine what that does to society. This was Goh Keng Swee and Rajaratnam's nightmare writ large. He said, and Rajaratnam echoed him. Rajaratnam, by the way, was the original formulator of the concept of the global city. Rajaratnam and Goh Keng Swee in 1972 said that, if we continue on this rate, there will be social problems and political problems that may be beyond our ken to solve. You try and govern 10 million, that kind of number of foreigners, that kind of density in Bishan, that kind of wealth inequality, that kind of stratified society, that kind of cemented lower classes that will follow from that. You try and govern it, okay, this will be more like Dubai, but without the privileges that Dubai citizens have for citizens, right? Dubai is the worst of Dubai, let alone the Switzerland of the Goh Chok Tong's long lost dream.
And we're still following the purple line today,
No, not quite. We are down to 1.5. We're following this line.
Blue one.
But what we need to do is to get below 1. Now, is this so difficult? All the OECD countries in the world do this. Germany, the top most competitive economies in the world, Germany does 0.3. And look at their productivity. Okay? Switzerland does 0.3. Right? Scandinavia does 0.5. Okay?
0.5 labor growth.
Labor force growth. Yeah, they're all on this line.
0.5%.
Half a percent per year.
But they've offset it with the productivity growth.
Because less
Not
labor
the
force
numbers.
growth means that firms, and this is Joan Robinson 101, this is basic economics, this is how economies develop. When you face full employment, this is Arthur Lewis's infinite supplies of labor, meeting full employment, if you enact sensible immigration and say, okay, we only grow immigrants at a certain rate, which by the way, in Goh Keng Swee's day, if I had mentioned to him that we would grow labor force growth at this rate, I would have been sacked. This is the difference. Okay, so if you actually constrain labor force growth to this, what happens is that firms have an incentive, they can't help it. If they want to grow, they have to automate, they have to introduce new technology, they have to introduce new products, they have to relocate labor intensive, they have to reorganize, they have to work hard at upgrading, and in all developed economies.
But cheaper to throw labor at the problem. That I learned.
It's more certain because you know you'll get the growth, you're not sure you'll get the productivity.
But there's competition, right?
You know?
Global competition.
Yeah. But you have to because the longer you don't, the more the poor grow at the bottom, and the bigger this final problem gets. This is a socio-economic political problem. The other is an economic problem. The bigger both these problems get, if you do not take the reins, face the uncertainties, and go the only sensible long-term route that you can. Okay, so we haven't done this yet. What does it require? In every other single OECD country, they have quotas that are based on this kind of trajectory because they've done the calculation. And it is in the national legislation, sorry. In Singapore, we are still on the labor system of if you fulfill this quota and this ratio and this pay this fine and you get your worker, right? So we do not know honestly how many people we're going to get in one given year until the end of the year. And this is why in the middle of the 2000s, the left hand did not know what the right hand was doing, right? In the JIT, you know all about that. That is why we grew the population by a couple of hundred, 300, 400, 500,000 more. On the one hand, the only people who knew were MOM, and people who didn't know, people building the infrastructure system, the people building the hospitals. Even the right hand didn't know what the left hand did, because the right hand who knew didn't know until it happened. This is the system we're still on. This cannot continue.
For the most ideal case, the light blue line, what kind of BP growth could we practically
2 to 3%. 2 to 3% with 2 to 3% real wage growth. You go here, you will get 5 to 6% GDP growth with much lower real wage growth. So you'll get a lower quality growth. You'll get a bigger economy, but with poorer citizens. Bigger economy, but with less technical capacity and expertise. A bigger economy, but socio-economically, socio-politically, extremely vulnerable and difficult to govern. Okay, so this is the trade-off.
Okay, I love the question. I think we all are more or less of the consensus opinion that we are not quite on the right track, and you pointed out a lot of examples about where we are not. This seminar is about the future of the Singapore. Where do we go from here?
Okay, so I mean, in order to know where we're going here, we need to understand the constraints of the past.
Know where we are.
So
How screwed up we are.
We all agree with all the things you say.
yes, but if we do not understand this, we do not understand that we need to adhere to this. We don't understand that we need those quotas. You know, we have no choice anymore. Right?
No, I think the first thing that we need to do is that 0.5 labour growth. Then how you do it is.
Yeah. So this is one ingredient of the future Singapore that has to be adhered to over a long period of time. Okay. So where are we in terms of the real economy? We are in a flat-out stagnation. There's external weakness, manufacturing, wholesale, retail, property is down. Investment, which is business sentiment, is down, and consumption is buoyed only by vehicles. The labor market is weakened. Now, what is happening? Now, essentially, just to understand where we are and where we will be if nothing is done, I just want you to know that there are two main big drags on the Singapore structural mechanism. The first is the blowing up of the housing bubble. This investment that is necessary because the housing bubble, which was the bubble, has collapsed and is still in the process of adjustment. There's still huge supply in private space, not HDB space, private space coming on that needs to be ingested. And the housing sector, construction, sales, agents, legal, etc., was big, 15% of GDP. Manufacturing is 20%, right? Okay, so it's a huge sector, and it is contracting for a couple of years. So you have a big drag from that. Now, the bigger drag is the correction, is this. It's trying to get from here to here. Okay, what does this mean? We have had to constrain, now you all know it's very difficult to get labor, right? And who suffers? It's not the MNCs. It is the 2/3 of people who find themselves employed by the SMEs. These are the guys who are suffering because it's difficult for them to upgrade. It's difficult for them to get new technology. It's difficult for them to automate. It's difficult for them to get new products. It's difficult to relocate. It is often beyond their means, and because it's beyond their means, the business confidence for 2/3 of the Singapore sector is down. And as Keynes has showed us, animal spirits are down, investment is down. When investment is down, the whole economy stagnates. It's because demand is being continually, because of this lack of confidence, because it's difficulty in the bulk of the corporate sector. The additional load of the housing sector. Demand is constantly being bled, hemorrhaged from the economy. So there's a steady hemorrhage of demand that has been going on since these processes have begun. And this is why we're growing at we want to grow at 2-3%, we're growing 1% below. And this will continue until, and because, this is not a short-term thing. This adjustment is going to go on for at least 10 years before it becomes successful, before you see the fruits of it, we see any fruits of it. But to have those fruits of it, you can't, again, just leave it to the market. You must intervene intelligently to increase your chances. Because we said, you throw labor at the problem, you know it will happen. You ask for productivity growth, it may not happen. So you have to intervene as intelligently as you can to try and increase the odds of it happening. And what do you need to do? First of all, you need to tend to the upgrading needs of 2/3 of the economy. You need to have an EDB for SMEs with the same kind of clout, with the same kind of no nonsense. We'll give them the help that they need, right? Mandate. That's one thing. The other thing is you have, as Keynes has taught us, you have to take care of aggregate demand. There's no point preaching to them when there's no business. You have to make sure there's enough demand in the economy for this transition to take place. Now, how do you manage demand in the economy? You have to manage it by macroeconomic policy. That's the job of the MAS and the Ministry of Finance. We have to have monetary and fiscal expansionary policy as long as this process is going on and bleeding us. So we give transfusion from monetary, we give transfusion from fiscal, so that the patient can at least walk around and receive our supply side help from this newly formed EDB, hopefully, which is still isn't there yet. And neither is the fiscal policy, and neither is the monetary policy. So, and there's problems with this. What are they? You can ease monetary policy for 1 or 2 years, but it's difficult to keep easing monetary policy for 5 to 10 years. Why? Because Singapore's monetary policy instrument is not the interest rate. In America, you can do this. In Germany, you can do this. Big economy can do this, because it just means a lower real interest rate, which is what the US is doing. For us, it's the real exchange rate. That is our instrument of monetary policy. This is the great innovation that Goh Keng Swee created. It's the correct innovation, but it is the instrument we as an open economy are stuck with. We can't change that. If you depreciate the exchange rate in real terms for 5 to 10 years, you will entrench inflationary expectations. The Singapore dollar will be weak for 5-10 years, and then you will have inflation coming in. We have to use sort of a steady to easy monetary policy, but we need to supplement it with fiscal expansionary policy. Now there's a problem because we're so import dependent that every dollar you spend, a lot of it leaks out. But nevertheless, we have to spend it intelligently in the sectors that stay most in the economy. And what are the sectors that stay most in the economy? Low-income sectors. These are the people consuming local services, eating at hawker centers. The poor, the expenditure of the poor, essential services, medical services, these educational services. You need consistently expansionary fiscal policy for a long period of time, and we are not used to that. So we've embarked on this ambitious supply side correction, which is restraining foreign labor. Everybody's screaming. But we haven't embarked on the corresponding either industrial policy to support our SMEs or the corresponding macro policy to support demand. If you're going to increase your budget deficit, essentially, by a couple of percent of GDP every year for the next 10 years, you're spending an additional 20% of GDP. Okay, so can we afford it? Right, so the short answer is yes, we'll discuss this later.